Morning, everybody. My name's Andy Williams, as you can see. Just a couple of minutes on me, because I don't know any of you. I've been in PepsiCo for 28 years, nearly 30 years. And interestingly, although PepsiCo is a very diverse business, I've spent most of my career working in franchise, and it's really the area that I feel very passionate about. But it is a very different business model to the rest of our business models that we work with. There are many experts in this room, and there are many people in this room that know an awful lot about India, so I'm not going to try and talk about that. What I will do, though, is just spend a few minutes giving you a perspective on franchise as I've seen it, as I travel around the world, but also as I've seen it evolve in different marketplaces and in different industries as well. If I look at the US and India, and the way that I sort of run franchise for PepsiCo is I tend to spend most of my time in the big markets that make a big difference, obviously, to ourselves. And, you know, I would break that up into places like India, China, Pakistan, Saudi, the UK, and the US and Brazil. And by looking at those markets, I can see the commonalities around the business model. But I can also see that each market is at a different phase in terms of how that business model is being used. And as I talk to our people in our organization, I always encourage them to really build a network regardless of what market they're in. And then we spend an awful lot of time making sure we share best practices from the different marketplaces. And as we've already heard this morning, you know, there is a tremendous business in the US on franchising. There's a huge opportunity for franchising in India. But I think as I look at what's going on in the world today, I also realize that the cost of getting it wrong is huge, but the opportunity is significant. And by that, I mean, there is so much pressure in terms of what we do with capital and how we get efficiency around capital. There's also tremendous pressure on how quickly we can build capabilities. And I think to do that, we have to work together. As Shiv pointed out, you know, we have to be very clear on roles and accountabilities. And I think today, if we don't get these partnerships right, it's very difficult to be competitive, and it's very difficult to meet the growth aspirations that we know are out there. So I think looking around the marketplaces and just learning from each other and building the network like you're doing here, I think is so valuable to franchise. Interestingly, I joined PepsiCo in the 1980s, and it was a very different world then. For example, we just literally had one brand. We had a food business with Frito-Lay. We had a beverage business with Pepsi. And I remember when I joined, franchising was very, very simple. And then after I'd been there for a couple of years, we added Diet Pepsi and 7-Up. And I literally thought my world had collapsed because I'd been so used to working on one brand, and now they're asking me to work on 3 brands, and that sort of felt a little unfair. I quickly realized, though, if you apply the simple franchise principles, it doesn't matter how many brands you're working on, it can be effective. Where it gets challenging is if I look at PepsiCo today, and yeah, it's $67 billion of revenue, but the portfolio has just transitioned amazingly. So as we've built our health and wellness portfolio, and obviously we've expanded away from beverage and snacks and into places like dairy, juice businesses, and a lot of nutrition, that adds complexity. And it adds complexity to the franchise business. And we spend a lot of time working through those complexities. I think any franchise business, the key thing to do is to try and simplify the model down. And if I look at our core business, there are clearly principles that play out, and anybody in any market can clearly understand those. So we spend a lot of time simplifying, standardizing, and then embedding. And if I look at our principles, you know, we've clearly got a global brand. That is what we own. That's our equity. We spend a lot of time, obviously, protecting that. We're very clear on the simple business model. And if we have a simple model, we can lift and shift it to different markets. And we're in about 120 markets now. So that becomes very valuable, but that simplicity is key. We talked about building capabilities. I'll come back to that. We've already talked about the need for role clarity. That may differ from one industry to another, but really being really clear on each other's roles and accountabilities, I think, is critical. The other thing is making sure that we've got competitive returns, so both parties have got returns that work for them. And then if we do that and we can be competitive in the marketplace, ultimately you've got a successful model. As our business, though, evolves, and I think this is key for a lot of businesses, we go through different phases. And if I look at our portfolio today, one part of it is about scale. And I think with scale businesses, it's really important that we have great planning and we have great execution. As we, though, move into different areas, we have to balance that with more agility so that we can develop innovation to support the proposition. And that becomes quite tough because it requires a nuanced sort of vision of what we're trying to do with the business. And it also requires different capabilities that have to be built as the business model evolves. So that, for me, is one of the complex areas as you go through the initial phase of growth within the franchise model. What I tend to do is, as I travel the globe looking at different markets, not only for us, but I also try and understand how different businesses are also franchising. And I think what you notice is there are sort of 4 or 5 very clear principles that play out across most franchise businesses. Firstly, and I guess this could be one way of defining success, make sure there's a really clear proposition and a very strong brand that can be lifted to other markets. And I think a mistake that people can make is trying to move too quickly before that is actually in place. The second piece is being really clear on what is the operating model and what are the core processes that support that model. And I think that has to be simplified, clearly articulated, clearly understood, and obviously supported with the right capabilities. I think for the brand owner going into new markets, it's critical that the right development teams are put in place and they match the capabilities of the franchisee. Really important that we leverage each other's capabilities and we don't try and do each other's jobs for ourselves. And then the final piece is, as we expand, make sure there's a global network. Now, we have a global network across 122 countries, but we don't have a global network as we try and build innovation and we try and go into new consumer spaces. But we try and build that very quickly. And I think the more you can do that, whether it be across India or with other markets, it becomes critical to the overall model. So if you take that as the principles for a franchise model, and this is just my perspective, it's not right or wrong, but it's a perspective. The next thing I look at is how do you then operationalize the model? And these are just my thoughts, having looked at various large markets around the world, looking at developed markets and developing and emerging markets. And I think these can pretty much apply anywhere. We look at continually, taking best practices and standardizing those and simplifying, and then embedding. And we break it out really into 3 critical areas. The first thing I always want to know is there an effective organization between both parties? And I can walk into a room with our people and a franchisee, and immediately I can tell if there's trust and are they working well together. But I would then break that out into 3 areas. First of all, I would want to make sure that the people in our franchise business have the right competencies. And obviously, on the other side, in the franchisee, we've got similar competencies, but they must complement each other so that we get the most out of the organization. Secondly, I would want to make sure that we have the right organizational structure in place so that both parties are getting full leverage from their capabilities. And then the third area, and I think this is the watch out that I find as I go around the world, because you've got an additional party working in the business model, the one watch out is decision making can slow down. And as I look at corporations, and as corporations go more matrixed in their operating model, we need to really make sure that within that, franchise can effectively run so that it's quick, decisions are made quickly, and made with the right people, and so on. And I think if you do that, one, you'll get into the right level of collaboration, which is certainly needed for franchise. You've got real clarity on the roles within the business model. The second area, and this is where I think the rubber hits the road, and it's around how do you make sure you've got an aligned system? Because if we're not aligned, there's a lot of wasted energy between both parties. So in terms of alignment, I would start with, okay, how do we assess our strategic issues and opportunities? That can be done differently. We have a standard model, but all I would say is have your own model in terms of making sure you've got alignment with the other party on the strategic issues and, importantly, the opportunities you're going to try and unlock. I think the next point then is really about making sure there's an effective joint planning process. And by that, I would break it into one-year joint plans. But I think because the world is changing so quickly nowadays, it's really important to have alignment on a 3-year plan. And then a governance process so that you can adjust and course correct as you go through that 3-year plan. And then the third area to ensure you've got alignment within that plan is I would encourage people to make sure, coming out of the plan, there's a business development agreement. And by that, I mean a real simplification of the overall business plan that really pulls out, in very good quality, the core strategies that we're trying to execute together. Really importantly, though, the material commitments required from both parties to deliver those strategies. And then the third area, the right measures to define success. And I think that is really at the sweet spot of operationalizing our franchise model. And then the third area is obviously about execution. So everything we do there needs to drive superior execution. There's a couple of areas I would always look at there. Are we spending our money together effectively? Because in the franchise relationship, we will be spending different amounts of money together, but on separate things. But if that's not synchronized, I think it's an ineffective spend. So driving for synchronization is really important. Second thing is making sure that we are brand building through that process. The brand value, is critical, obviously, to the franchisor, but it's also critical to the franchisee. And by that, I mean making sure that our advertising and marketing money and other expenditures are really driving both consumer pull and push. And then the third area is making sure that we've got the right measurements. And I think those measurements really have to focus in on, one, what is happening to brand equity, and two, what is happening to the return on invested capital. And I would call those out as the two really strong measures that we have to think about as we go forward. So as I summarize that sort of view on, franchising as I may see it, I think there are some questions that, as you think about going into franchise and building that model, that we should be conscious of. Is there a consistent and transparent governance environment, not only with our own business, but with local regulators, with local laws and so on? And I know we're going to talk about that through the rest of the day. I think the other point is there truly a well-established business model in the home market that can be lifted and shifted? Shiv referred to, we're moving into franchising snacks. That operating model is different to the one we deploy on beverages. Very conscious that we have to make sure we understand the difference there. Making sure that whatever we have in terms of processes and the model, it is ready for export. We have to be able to lift and shift as we go forward. Fourth one, there have to be sustainable returns for everybody. If the returns work for one party and not the other, the model doesn't work. So really making sure before we jump into this that they are there, and making sure that whatever we're jumping into, obviously there is demand for it in the home market. So they're just my thoughts. It's just a perspective. I'm here all day. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I look forward to discussing this further as we go through today and into this evening. Thank you.